смогут задать свои вопросы в чате во время вебинара или после. В конце у нас будет немного времени для того, чтобы задать вопросы. И также у нас, будет предоставлен перевод. Я бы хотела сказать пару слов о организации нашей. Это EKOM, это Евразийская коалиция по здоровью и правам, гендерному и сексуальному многообразию, и международное неправительственное объединение, которое борется за создание на территории Восточной Европы и Центральной Азии благоприятных условий для того, чтобы у геев, бисексуалов и трансляндей был доступ к услугам в области сексуального, репродуктивного здоровья, также в области профилактики, лечения ВИЧ. И за то, чтобы все эти услуги были ориентированы на права человека. Для достижения этого мы проводим серию вебинаров для информирования сообщества активистов и активистов всего региона. Сегодняшняя наша тема будет право на здоровье ЛГБТ, представление в альтернативных докладов в договорных органах ЕКОМ. So I'm going to move to English now and going to introduce our speaker today is Anna Abteauri. I hope I'm pronouncing right your last name. And she's from Georgia, and she is gonna she's going to talk about treaty bodies, and she's a legal advocacy officer of the equality movement. And without any further delay, I will pass the words to you, Anna.
Thank you, Zamfira. Good afternoon, everybody. Your pronounce was actually very good. I'm Anna Abteauri. I represent Equality Movement, which is the Georgian LGBTQI-based community-based organization. We are working in several different fields. We are one of the largest service providers. We provide social, legal, medical services. We are also working on advocacy and changes in the legislation and policies. So one of the main direction of our work is communication and cooperation with the international organizations. And of course, one of the most important international organization we are cooperating with is the United Nations and its treaty bodies. So today I'm going to talk about our cooperation and how we're using these mechanisms to improve human rights situation in Georgia, especially for LGBTQI community. So now I'm going to share my screen. I hope everybody can see it.
Yep, we can see it. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Now it's perfect. Yeah.
So I'm going to discuss several topics today. First will be contextual information, so what is happening in Georgia and how the country guarantees rights to equality and what are the basic human rights violations of LGBTQI people living in Georgia. Also, because we are focused on health issues and right to health, I will also discuss right to health regarding HIV/AIDS. I'm going to review current legislation and main challenges faced by people living with HIV. And of course, we will discuss working with the UN treaty bodies, and I'm going to review some of our recent shadow reports submitted to the several UN treaty bodies, and then I will be glad to receive additional questions from the participants. So let me start with the rights to equality and the review of Georgian legislation. So spoiler alert is that we actually have very progressive legislation which guarantees equal rights for everyone, as you can see. However, the problem here is that the implementation, the problem is the implementation of this legislation. Because, as I've already mentioned, we have very progressive legislation because of two reasons. First of all, usually very progressive lawyers are working on legislative changes. And second of all, in 2013, Georgia signed signed agreement with the European Union, which means that we were in charge to adopt some legislation, including anti-discrimination legislation. And in 2014, the Parliament of Georgia adopted law of Georgia on the elimination of all forms of discrimination, or in other words, anti-discrimination law. And here, as you can see, we have, first of all, the Constitution of Georgia, which guarantees equal rights for everyone. However, we don't have sexual orientation and gender identity as a protected grounds in the Constitution, but we have sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression as a protected ground in the law of Georgia on the elimination of all forms of discrimination. However, the important point here is that actually, the Constitutional Court of Georgia said in 2014 that despite the fact that we don't have sexual orientation as a protected ground in the Constitution, sexual orientation is actually protected by Constitution, and any discrimination based on person's sexual orientation must be prohibited by Constitution. We also have criminal legislation, of course, which also so we have these aggravating factors for punishment, which means that if crime is committed based on a person's any identity, like language, sexual orientation, gender expression, all of these are considered as hate-motivated crimes, and this might be aggravating factors for a punishment, which means that liability, which means that somebody who committed a hate crime will receive higher punishment than somebody who committed same crime without hate motive. We also have Human Rights Protection and Investigation Quality Monitoring Department. This is a department under the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and this was established in 2017, and this is one of the most important governmental body, because first of all, this is probably the only body who actively cooperates with the civil rights organizations and helps them to protect the rights of victims of hate crimes. And basically what this department is doing is that the department monitoring the investigation of hate crimes, as well as any violence committed against women, also domestic violence, and it also tries to identify gap and prepare some legislative changes, as well as adopt policy documents to improve the situation and also to fill the gaps during the investigation process. And one of the most important role of this department is analyzing the statistics of hate crimes, which is very problematic in Georgia in so many different ways, because first of all, we did not have unified statistics for so many years, which means that each governmental bodies were collecting data on their own. For instance, the Ministry of Internal Affairs had its own statistics of hate crimes. General Prosecutor's Office had its own statistics. So sometimes when we were comparing these numbers, we could not tell how many hate crimes were committed during the year, which was really problematic. And right now we have unified statistics, which means that the Ministry of Internal Affairs, General Prosecutor's Office, the courts system, and the National Statistics Service are involved of collecting the data, and Human Rights Protection and Investigation Quality Monitoring Department is in charge on behalf of Ministry of Internal Affairs to analyze these statistics. So let's move on. HIV/AIDS. This is also challenging issue if you look at the Georgia legislation, because first of all, we have this specialized law, which is law of Georgia on HIV infection and AIDS. It's actually a very controversial law because the purpose of this law is to ensure the health care for the people living with HIV or those who are at high risk of HIV. However, this is controversial because this is the specified role, which means that this law referring HIV/AIDS when we don't have any other legislation regarding to any other infections. So some people think that such treatment or adopting such legislation might negatively affect people living with HIV because it might increase stigma toward HIV or people living with HIV. However, it's unlikely to adopt different legislation or just get rid of this law. So this is like a general law. It's a kind of regulates the testing issues related to testing, and also the right to health and right to different services, and this is like a basic law. We also have some more problematic legislation. For instance, Criminal Code of Georgia criminalizes infecting with AIDS. That's the problem here is that we have Article 132 in the Criminal Code of Georgia, which criminalizes infecting with any diseases or viruses, which is like a general article. And if you infect anybody or create a threat of infection with any different viruses, you will be punished under the Article 132. But as you can see, we have Article 131, which particularly targets people who might create a threat or infect somebody with HIV/AIDS, which is really problematic because, again, it might increase stigma against the people who are living with HIV or who are at high risk of HIV/AIDS. Because actually the one thing I have to say is that this is kind of dead article, because we are always trying to check whether somebody was punished under this article, but actually what we can see is that in the last several years nobody was punished with this article, and we even haven't had any investigation of like possible crime of infecting with AIDS. So it's a dead article, but because it's kind of discriminatory, we tried to change this article, and we offered the parliament to just rewrite this article, and we offered them that we actually told them that Article 132, which I've already mentioned, which is criminalization of infecting with any viruses, it can include HIV/AIDS, but they told us that this article is neutral, and actually it doesn't have any discriminatory conditions. So right now we have this article, but as I already told you, this is kind of like dead article. But we also have success stories, kind of, but not in the legislation, but in the practice of the Constitutional Court of Human Rights, which was really important. And actually several activists and organizations were working on these cases for like about 45 years. So here we have two cases in the Constitutional Court of Georgia. First case was submitted by 5 individuals. So in 2009, and in 2000, the Minister of Health signed the order, and since then, homosexual men have not been allowed to donate blood. So this man thought that this order was against Constitution and violates the right to equality. And actually, the Constitutional Court of Georgia agreed with the complaint and said it was discriminatory because of several reasons. First of all, there was this word, homosexual men. So as I already mentioned, homosexual men have not been allowed to donate blood. So the court said that term homosexual was unconstitutional and discriminatory because being a homosexual doesn't mean that you are under high risk of infecting with HIV. And second of all, this ban was unconstitutional because we already know the testing system and how the medicine works. So anyone can know his or her status. So it was certainly unconstitutional to ban people from donating blood forever. So after that, the Ministry of Health actually changed this order. First of all, they changed the word homosexual, and right now we have a word MSM, which is medically right, because MSM group might be a high risk of infecting with HIV. But what they did was that they banned MSM men from donating blood for 5 years. For 10 years. And as you can see on case number 2, some of the applicants again asked the Constitutional Court to check whether this prohibition was against Constitution, and they argued that this article actually violates right to equality, which is protected under the Constitution. Again, Constitutional Court says that banning somebody from donating blood for 10 years was unconstitutional. And the court also pointed out that the modern technologies allowed for the detection of HIV/AIDS in donations, making a ban unnecessary. So Constitutional Court once again in 2019 said that nobody can ban MSM people from donating blood for such a long period of time. So after that, actually the Ministry of Health was going to maintain the ban, but for 5 years rather than 10 years. But after that, after the Constitutional Court made its decision, Equality Movement sent recommendation to the Ministry of Health and asked the ministry to change this regulation. And right now, MSM men can't donate blood after 12 months from the risk behavior, which is like medically it's medically proved that this is like a window period, and you can be tested after 12 years from the risk behavior. And if you are not positive, it means that you are not infected with HIV. So it's absolutely safe to be anyone's donor. So it was very progressive for Georgia. As I already told you, this we had 2 court decisions, and the order was completely changed in 2019, at the end of 2019, and it's kind of progressive because right now some other European countries, including Sweden, is working on such changes. Canada, for instance, also is working on these changes. And we already did it. So let me move on the working with UN treaty bodies, which is very important because as you already saw, we and I mentioned that we have kind of good legislation, and we also have Constitutional Court of Georgia and other human rights institutions, for instance, public defenders, ombudsperson's institution, which is also in charge of monitoring equality and right to equality and how people are expressing these rights in Georgia. And these two institutions are usually allies of LGBTQI community. However, when it comes to the implementation of some particular legislation, we need to get involved UN treaty bodies and other international organizations to push the government to adopt the changes or to implement the legislation we already have. So what actually the UN treaty bodies are doing is that they represent committees of independent experts that monitor implementation of the core of international human rights treaties. So each committee had its own experts, and you can periodically submit your complaint or your report. Today I'm going to talk about submitting the reports and also the review of several reports we submitted in last 2 years. First of all, let me start with CEDAW committee, which is a committee against the elimination of discrimination against women. We kind of using this mechanism because so there's a trick. Sometimes, first of all, sometimes when the government of Georgia doesn't want to include LGBTQI community somewhere in policy documents, for instance, we kind of tried to use the gender equality issues to talk about LGBTQI issues, and that's what we are doing inside the country. But of course, you can also submit your shadow reports to the CEDAW committee and discuss the human rights violations of LGBTQI people. And in 2021, we submitted our reports to the CEDAW committee, and we discussed human rights violation of lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and intersex women. And you probably know that when you're submitting your reports, you have to concentrate on several particular issues. So we are always trying to discuss what is more important or what is more critical. And under this shadow report, we covered 3 main topics. First of all was homophobic, transphobic hate crimes. As I've already mentioned, hate crimes are criminalized by the Criminal Code of Georgia. We also have specialized body, Human Rights Department, under the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which is kind of monitoring the investigation process of hate crimes. However, in practice, we have several programs regarding hate crimes. For instance, clarification of hate crimes is problematic, which means that sometimes when somebody commits hate crimes, of course the police starts investigation and the person might be punished, but the person might be punished for I don't know, violence, for instance, physical attacks, but not for hate crime. This is a problem. And also many people do not want to report hate crimes because of several reasons. Maybe some of them are afraid of their privacy because they might be a victim of force coming out by police, and also some of them do not trust law enforcement agencies and do not want to have communication with them. Also, one of the most problematic issues in Georgia is legal gender recognition, which affects mostly transgender people. We actually, this is the only issues which is not actually recognized by law and regulated by the current legislation, only for one reason, because when we are trying to advocate this issue, the state always says that the state doesn't have political will to regulate this issue. That's why every time we are submitting our reports to any UN treaty bodies or any other international organization, we always highlight this issue. This is because this is most important issue, because in any other fields we have some progresses, at least we have some legislation, and the only thing we want to do is to implement this legislation, and that's the issue when we don't have any legislation, and it's extremely problematic. So right now we have some ministry orders which kind of force transgender people to undergo the surgery, which is life-threatening and expensive procedure, and otherwise they can't change their gender marker in their ID cards or passports. So that's why we always try to highlight this issue. And actually, Georgia received recommendations from the UN treaty bodies and other international organizations multiple times to adopt the legislation and guarantee safe and fast plus transparent procedures for transgender people. And of course, in this report, we highlighted equal to healthcare. We discussed two main topics. This was, of course, the healthcare carries accessibility for the people who are at high risk of HIV, or for those who are living with HIV. And also, this is very problematic to for the transgender people to receive trans-specified medical services. And actually we are advocating with the state to adopt some regulations to guarantee equal access to health services for transgender and intersex people. Next I'm gonna discuss CCPR reports, which we submitted with the ECOM, both of them. The first one was submitted in 2021, and the second one was submitted this year, this summer. And as you can see, we highlighted more issues than we did in during the CEDAW review. So the CCPR is the Committee for Civil and Political Rights, and we kind of have more opportunities to discuss. We actually can discuss anything we want. We kind of, and as you can see, we have here gender identity issues, which is the same, because as I've already mentioned, we are always trying to talk about that. And we are expecting recommendations from each treaty bodies, and we actually received these recommendations regarding to gender identity issues and legal gender recognition. What was different from the CEDAW report is that we also covered the freedom of assembly, or freedom of expression and of peaceful assembly in the CCPR reports. This is one of the most problematic issues for LGBTQI community, because you probably know that actually LGBTQI community is the only social group in Georgia who has never expressed its right to peaceful assembly, because the first time huge anti-LGBT rally attacked several LGBTQI community members was in 2013 on May 17, and after that community didn't have any opportunity to celebrate Pride Week or May 17. And you probably also heard what happened on July 5, 2021, when Pride March was cancelled because of threats, and anti-LGBT rally was organized by some far-right groups, and they've kind of attacked journalists and the offices of the organizer of Tbilisi Pride and the office of its supporter organizations. And this year, Tbilisi Pride organized Pride Week, but they did not organize a march because they know that this will be attacked once again. So as you can see, LGBTQI community don't have any opportunity to express this right, and also the state has clear position that they can protect anybody inside of any building, but if LGBTQI community or any organization or any group decides to have some event outside like buildings or in the public area, the state can't protect such activity. So that's why this is the state's clear position, and that's why we need some international organizations to tell them that this is very important to protect the rights of expression and peaceful assembly. So let's move on the implementation of the recommendations we are receiving from the treaty bodies. So the first thing we have to know is that actually nobody, the recommendations are not mandatory, which means that country is not in charge to implement any of these recommendations. And as I already told you, these recommendations are given by the independent experts of these committees. So maybe some countries sometimes doesn't take these recommendations seriously, and I can tell that Georgia could be one of them. So we discussed the CCPR reports submitted by EKOM and Equality Movement. And during the last review of Georgia, which was in the last summer, we actually received specific recommendations regarding to protecting of rights of LGBTQI people. We received different recommendations regarding to elimination of any forms of discrimination, hate crimes, and to support equality. And what was important, the committee also recommended the states to take adequate measures to prevent homophobic and transphobic speech by politicians and religious leaders, which is really important because these people are actually they are leading this hate speech and homophobic and transphobic attitudes towards LGBTQI people, or they are directly or indirectly supporting far-right groups who are attacking LGBTQI people and groups. So it was really very important. But how we are trying to monitor the implementation process of the recommendation. And as I've already told you, it's not mandatory to implement any of this recommendation. However, because state is actively participating in this review process, and because state is engaged in this process, of course, if somebody wants to take the state seriously, the state needs to implement some of these recommendations. And states can take several actions to do it. First of all, state can change the legislation if there is a gap in the legislation, or states can adopt legislation if it's necessary. For instance, as I've already told you, we have several recommendations received, and the state needs to adopt special legislation, or probably the Minister of Justice needs to sign an order to regulate the legal gender recognition issue, and also state might adopt some policy documents or take some actions. So what happened after we received the last recommendations from the CCPR was that state actually finalized drafting of the human rights strategy, which is the basic human rights document of the state, and it's kind of gives the vision of the state's policies regarding to human rights equality. So the state, the government, which is in charge to write and adopt this document, finalized this process after the last review of Georgia by CCPR, and so here are some recommendations received by CCPR, and of course these recommendations or parts of these recommendations might be included in this document. However, despite the fact that state agreed on all of these recommendations, state this document, human rights strategy, doesn't say a word about LGBTQI community, which means that state is not going to implement this recommendation. And we also use different UN mechanisms to achieve our goals, to push the states to do something. First of all, so the Human Rights Council writes reports on each state, and each year they are asking us to send input, and we are doing it. This year we sent them our inputs, which also covered the most basic challenges regarding to hate crimes and hate speech and far right groups, which I've already discussed. UN also has independent experts on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So the independent expert visited Georgia in 2019 and wrote a report about Georgia, and it's kind of highlighted all the most challenging issues LGBTQI people face in Georgia, and independent expert also sent recommendations to the state. And one of the most important UN mechanism we are using is UPR, which is Universal Periodic Review. This is very important, and probably this is the only mechanism state takes seriously, because this is different from the UN treaty bodies, because as I've already said, UN treaty body represents independent experts, so the recommendations are written by independent experts, but during the UPR review, actually any state gets recommendation from member states. So if you want to have good diplomatic relations with particular states, of course you have to take its recommendations seriously. So that's why Georgia takes UPR more seriously than the recommendations written by UN treaty bodies. However, because UPR is a long-term process, and sometimes it's more effective to submit reports to the UN treaty bodies That's why we are using UN treaty bodies often than UPR. So that's what I wanted to tell you. I hope it was informative, and I'll be happy to receive any comments and questions from you.
Oh, thank you, Anna. That was really informative. Yeah, it's actually, I'm impressed. I mean, I knew that Georgia has implemented sexual orientation and identity parts in their legislations, but like I didn't know exactly where it was, like that it's in a criminal law you mentioned, and then the law, yes, like in the both, but it's not in constitution. Am I right?
Yeah, because our constitution was adopted in 1995, so at the time nobody would ever discuss these issues and equality based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And our constitution has changed a lot since 1995, but we have never changed this article. Nobody ever had this problem with this article and the constitution, but we have a sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression and in any other legislation. For instance, as I mentioned, we have anti-discrimination law. It's also protected in the Criminal Code of Georgia, legislation which protects rights to health, like any law which regarding to health, and labor code. So we have sexual orientation and gender identity everywhere in our legislation.
That's impressive. That's really cool. We have a question here. So can you tell us how difficult is the process to submit the report for NGO that have no experience in it? And what tips can you give for the newcomers?
That's a good question. First of all, as I mentioned that we are using several different UN mechanisms, and I would say that submitting reports to the UN treaty bodies might be the easiest process for anybody, because you don't have you don't need to know some specific for instance, during the UPR process, there is like guideline how you are submitting this report or how you're writing this report, and it's also really long-term process, and you kind of need the assistance to follow this process. But when you are writing and submitting a report for the UN treaty bodies, you don't have this like this list to-do list, what to do. And actually what's the most important thing that is that each treaty body always publish a list of issues or list of themes, which means that the list of themes is a document which shows what will be prioritized from the committee, or what the committee wants to hear from you. So those are these issues which the committee thinks that are the more problematic, because before any civil rights organization or NGO or any group will submit its own report, states submit its report, and after a state submits reports, usually local human rights institutions, in our case public defender, submits its own report, and after that anyone can submit this report. So the first recommendation is to look at the state's report, and then look at the list of themes. Then you can start working on your report. However, in my own experience, sometimes we can see that a list of themes not always meet our expectations, because state might submit reports, and usually state wants to talk about progresses and that we don't have any problems, but we know that there are some problems and challenges, and we want to discuss them more. So you're actually free to discuss whenever you want, but it's always good to look at the state report to kind of respond some of their comments, or there might be some information in this report which is not true, or you can criticize. So this is very good opportunity to use.
Great, yes, it's a great tool. I don't see any other question here, but I have one more question connected to the recommendations. So you mentioned that government of Georgia received recommendations, the last recommendations from committee, CCSPR committee, and you said they're probably not gonna, like, they're not intended to follow those recommendations. What are the ways to pressuring government, so they implement them, or at least they consider those recommendations to include in the following laws or amendments and stuff? Is there any ways that we can influence or national governments and regional ones?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, because our point is to push the government to do something, but because the government doesn't usually listen to the organizations or activists, we need somebody like international organization or somebody like objective body which would say the same what we are saying to the government. So that's why we use this different UN mechanisms. Because the state, Georgia is the member of the United Nations, and politically, economically, is sometimes dependent on international organizations like the United Nations. Of course, partly it's in charge to adopt part of these recommendations. So right now, as I already told you, we were expecting implementation of these recommendations through the including some of them into the human rights strategy, which did not happen. However, the state doesn't say that it's not going to adopt these recommendations, because the state has time to implement them. So right now, what we know from the government is that despite the fact that we don't have LGBTQI issues in the human rights strategy, we will definitely have LGBTQI chapter in the human rights action plan. So they are going to implement this recommendation. And of course, we don't know that they will certainly do it. However, because we have these recommendations received by international bodies, we can always use them to push them to do what they promised us.
Okay, so yeah. So basically, it's a remind that recommendations were received by international bodies, and they have power to follow those recommendations, or remind them later about them. Okay. All right. So as I see, there is no other questions, and yes. And if the audience don't have any more questions, we can probably finish here. Thank you, Anna, for today's session. It was really informative, and thanks for sharing the experience. I hope it will help the activists who are going to watch it after the webinar on our YouTube. Thanks a lot for everybody who participated and were today with us. And well, goodbye.
Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for everyone who was participating. Goodbye. Have a good day.
Thanks.